Beyond the Game. Brought to you by Turkish Airlines.
Later this year, the Rugby World Cup is to take place in Japan. It's the first time the tournament will be held in Asia, and it's seen as a huge step forward in developing the sport throughout the world. I'm Paul Scott, and on today's special edition of Beyond the Game, we look at proposals that could change World Rugby as we know it and hinder the game's global development. Plans for an annual 12-team international competition have been roundly criticised, but are World Rugby listening? So plans to overhaul international rugby have sent shockwaves through the sport. Unions, players and journalists from around the world have slammed those who run the game. World Rugby is accused of chasing money and lining its own pocket at the expense of smaller nations. Now, the sport is played in 121 countries across the globe, with 8.5 million people regularly playing the game. This year, 20 nations from all continents have qualified for the World Cup in Japan. The sides are split into 4 groups, which gives smaller sides like Namibia the chance to take on Tier 1 teams such as New Zealand and South Africa. But the sport's governing body wants to add a new annual World League featuring 12 nations. The competition will run each year except those years where there is a World Cup being played, and it will feature all of the sides from both the Six Nations and the Rugby Championship, plus the United States and Japan. The idea of cutting the smaller nations out of the picture has prompted anger and criticism from all corners of the globe. Lance Santos explains why.
2019 was supposed to be rugby's greatest year yet. Japan will host Asia's first ever World Cup, and rugby is breaking new ground. The traditional Southern Hemisphere dominance is fading. And as things stand, a handful of teams could win the World Cup. But off the field, though, the game is in disarray and nobody's really sure of which way rugby is headed. In the last few days, a leaked report revealed that World Rugby had planned a new global league to reignite the game. The format features 12 nations and would take place every November instead of the traditional autumn internationals. The idea is being torn apart in the media. People across the world are unhappy that the Pacific Island nations have been ignored. Players fear that there's now even more games packed into an already tight schedule. And those who run the sport have been vague, to say the least. World Rugby is facing a lot of criticism.
It's the largest shake-up in modern rugby history. That usually means it doesn't happen.
What is the future for rugby? Is it more international matches or is it more club matches? I'm not sure.
Massive change in terms of the Rugby Championship.
The biggest problem so far, Pacific Island nations locked out completely. Don't get a look in.
The noise of money seems to be drowning out everyone else, and I've got a feeling that money is American dollars.
And the players don't want it. You know, they're overplayed now, so that's not going to happen. I think it's going to kill the Rugby World Cup.
The proposed World League has split the game into 3 camps: the haves, the have-nots, and the aspirational. The haves are the sacred cows of World Rugby, the backbone of the global game. They wield the power and make all the money. Like England, a nation who made over $20 million from one match last year when they sold out Twickenham against the All Blacks. But what makes this so cynical is when you consider that not one Pacific Island nation is part of the 12 potentials in the alleged league. It is at odds with the reality of the game. Pacific players make up almost 20% of all professional rugby players playing in the sport right now. Players from the Pacific backgrounds appear in the national teams of Australia, New Zealand, Wales, England, France and Ireland. It indicates that commercial appeal is as much behind the proposal as is what is good for the game. Basically, the island nations don't bring in as much money and thus are being shut out.
They're afraid, they're afraid of the talent that is here. It's raw and it's huge, and it's the impact that it has, it's huge.
Then there is the third group who should feel slightly embarrassed to be part of this conversation. When Japan were granted the World Cup hosting duties for this year's World Cup, it was met with excitement. The game was growing, rugby was making a play in Asia, but now, for Japan, who have one notable victory in their entire rugby history, it shows a yearning for commercial big bucks that goes from looking a bit iffy in the light of day to looking rather cynical. The last team to make up the 12 is the USA. The Eagles are a rugby team who are now spreading their wings in the sevens. But in the 15s version of the game, they are still very much a third-tier side. Put simply, it seems the new league is strictly for the big bucks of TV and the potential of growing the game in North America.
I think you're thinking that this is an excellent move because you probably then recognise that there is definitely room for money to be made, because that's what these guys are in it for. They're not there out of the goodness of their souls, sadly. They're not there simply because they love the game of rugby. They're there to make money.
But that's just the setup of the tournament that's causing huge issues, and it doesn't even take a second to consider what it does to the rest of the sport. Questions like, what does it mean to the World Cup?
World Rugby, as I understand it, makes something like 90% of their revenue from the Rugby World Cup, which of course is only every 4 years. So they're needing to find a new model, a new way of bringing in decent funds that can help sustain the game worldwide. So that's the understanding of the motivation. The difficulty, of course, is that you have so many different stakeholders.
With this competition played throughout the year and a final series in November, will anybody want to play a World Cup every 4 years? And what about the British and Irish Lions series? A tradition every 4 years. Where does that fit in? Player welfare. In a conference call about the potential competition, World Player of the Year Johnny Sexton said that too much is being expected of the players to play so much rugby. All Blacks captain Kieran Reid said that the players don't want a substandard, money-driven weekend competition that doesn't work for the players, and it certainly doesn't work for the clubs. The problem for World Rugby, they have not left themselves very much time. They want this all to happen in 2020, which is next year. It is all happening very fast. The bosses of the game are being rushed back to Dublin this month to discuss it all again. It looks like an option to cut the game's smaller nations out of the fun seemed like a false move from an organisation who seem more concerned with short-term gain rather than growing the game.
Well, Ross Karl is a rugby journalist covering the game in the Southern Hemisphere, and he joins us now. Ross, thank you very much for talking to us. Firstly, can you just outline for us exactly what these proposals are in their current form and how exactly they came to light?
Well, essentially the proposal is that every game becomes of some sort of value throughout the year in a World League leading towards a final series. So, you know, the games that happen in June, the 3-test series that happen in June that now necessarily more friendlies really than having something big on the line will now become part of a World League. You play every other team in the top 12 teams in the world. Then there's finals afterwards. And we find out every single year who is the best team in the world of rugby. Now, it appears to me that there's a lot of people who don't like it. One, you've got the Tier 2 nations who don't like it. You've also got the players who don't really like it, because the essence of this league, when they were trying to organise it in the first place, was that it was supposed to fix the player welfare problems that rugby has and allow Tier 2 nations to have a better crack, play at least 2 games a year against the Tier 1 nations. It's achieved neither of those things. So the Tier 2 nations are unhappy and the players' associations are incredibly unhappy because we have a problem with club versus country. In the end, players are playing too much rugby and not getting enough rest. Clubs aren't allowing some players to play tests in some parts of the world, and players are playing up to 30 games a year and not getting an adequate off-season. So they came back with a proposal that was all about making money and not about doing the right things for rugby around the world. And the Players Association got into it straight away. There was a leak from somebody. It was printed in the paper in New Zealand. The next thing you know, the Players Association, they had a press release pretty much ready to go with the best players in the world saying how disappointed they were. Kieran Reid, Jonathan Sexton, really, top quality players. So no one's really happy with this thing at all.
It has been pretty much universally criticised, hasn't it, from all quarters of the game. Do you think that the reaction has surprised World Rugby, or do you think they were perhaps just testing the water in some respects?
But I think they were far too far along the way to be testing the water. World Rugby took this to fans and media outlets in the respective markets where they were hoping to make money. So you don't do that with a proposal unless you're a long way down the chain. And today I spoke with Karen Reid, and Karen Reid told me that they had a chat with World Rugby as the Players Association. They weren't happy with how it went, and they were forced to come out in public and criticise them. So that says that they've gone against what the players want in search of money, in search of keeping the powers that be in power. And that's very disappointing.
Of course, the All Blacks are the most commercially successful international rugby team. Is there an element that New Zealand rugby has been guilty in years gone by of cherry-picking perhaps the best talent from those Pacific Island nations and then not doing enough in return?
Look, I think that shows probably a misunderstanding of the relationship between Pacific Islanders and New Zealand. A lot of Pacific Island players are born in New Zealand. In fact, less than 3% of All Blacks over all time have been born outside of New Zealand. So, look, you can be Samoan and a New Zealander. You can be Tongan and a New Zealander. And I think that's a lot of things. A lot of Northern Hemisphere people don't quite understand that. On the other hand, there have been a few players along the way who've been in the Pacific Islands who have come over for school in New Zealand, done residency and become All Blacks. And with that being said, that's New Zealand bringing them into our system. And therefore, we need to look after the Pacific Islands that have brought those kind of players. I'm talking about people like Sitiveni Sivivatu, who, you know, was a wonderful All Black for a short period of time. And New Zealand rugby really has a responsibility there, and it needs to step up. We've only taken one test to the islands, a test in Samoa in 2015. If you look at the number of tests they played against Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, it's a handful. It's nothing at all. And New Zealand should be playing 1 to 2 test matches every year against our Pacific neighbours to give them a chance. In saying that, a lot of those players are playing in Europe, and those players need to be released by the European clubs for those games. And right now, especially in France, those French billionaires who own those teams are not releasing those players. In fact, in many cases, they're offering contracts worth more to those players in order for them to retire from international rugby, which is terrible, and it shows one of the major issues we have within World Rugby.
OK, debate's going to rumble on for a few months yet. Ross, thank you very much for your thoughts. Thanks for talking to us. Well, up until 1995, rugby was an entirely amateur game without millions of dollars swirling around the sport. Some see these proposals as rugby selling out for a few extra dollars. Others believe it's the progression of professionalism and big business flexing its muscle. But what about those nations that can't compete financially, such as the tiny Pacific Island nations, who are not just fan favourites, but also provide a huge percentage of the game's professional players? Now, if you look at the proposed teams in this league, you'll see the flags of the USA and Japan. They're not exactly traditional rugby powerhouses. America's population dwarfs the rest of the proposed nations, and more potential viewers means more potential advertising revenue. There are reports that Amazon and IMG are involved in this new proposed venture, and when you look at the size of the economies of the countries involved, you can see why the USA and Japan are perhaps being invited along. So looking at population and GDP, the likes of Fiji, Samoa and Tonga are left trailing the big nations, despite giving World Rugby almost a quarter of the game's professional players. These are proud rugby nations that have punched above their weight on a global scale for years. Fiji, the game's first ever sevens gold medal winners at the Rio Olympics, have made the World Cup quarter-finals 3 times, while Samoa knocked Wales out of the 1991 World Cup to make their first quarter-final. Well, Mike Umaga is president of the Pacific Islanders Players Association and a former Samoa international. He joins us now on the show. Thank you very much for talking to us, Mike. It's really good to see it. So there have been suggestions then that a boycott of the World Cup later this year would be a legitimate player protest about these proposals. Is that something that you've discussed? Do you see that as a realistic possibility?
These talks have been done pretty quickly. So, you know, at this point in time, it is one of our options. There is a lot of talking still to be done between the board members, but we do feel passionate about this, and it may be, you know, one of our only very real options left.
You say that these talks have happened quickly. Can you talk us through the process and how much involvement the Pacific Island nations have had in these discussions?
Well, this is the issue. A lot of the talks have taken place without a lot of Pacific Island contact. In terms of the IRP and the PRP, those are two associations that are funded by World Rugby. But in terms of having a presence in those groups, I think we only have one representative. Like I said before, the talks have accelerated with not a lot of contact with the Pacific Island Union.
The proposals in their current form, what are your biggest concerns with them?
As a board, it's taking Pacific Islands out of a world game. How can you have a world league that doesn't involve a Pacific Island nation? With it being, ring-fenced at 12. If we look at the world rankings at the moment, Fiji are in at 9th and don't even get a look in. So we're all, it's well documented what Pacific Island rugby brings to the world stage. And I think to have no representation from the Pacific Islands is inclusive of rugby union.
Players have to go overseas, particularly for club rugby, but also sometimes for international rugby as well, particularly to New Zealand and Australia. Are you disappointed that there hasn't been more vocal support from that part of the world?
I am quite surprised, actually, but if there was some Super Rugby involvement through the islands, then there wouldn't be that conveyor belt going to either Australia or New Zealand. So they could stand to lose quite a bit in terms of personnel.
Of course, you elected to play for Samoa. Your brother played for New Zealand. Considering everything that we've just discussed, what would your advice be now to young rugby players in the Pacific Islanders? Would you advise them to look overseas?
The rugby career in terms of financial status would have to be off island and currently. So if the opportunity came, you wouldn't stop players from doing that. But for our game to grow on island, we need to keep those good players in the countries of Tonga, Fiji and Samoa. So you've got nothing to back that up with because there's no financial help on island. It really is that is a tough question.
And finally then, what is your message to World Rugby? Because these discussions are going to be going on over the next few months. There are going to be changes. What's your message? 25% of professional rugby players Pacific Island descent. So how could you not have more of those people involved in what you're claiming to be the flagship of international rugby? All we ask is that World Rugby be fair and that everyone be consulted through the process and that everyone gets a fair opportunity to, if not in the initial stages, then there has to be promotion and relegation at the very least. Everyone has to have an opportunity to aspire to something. And if the World League goes ahead, then everyone in the world has to have that opportunity to aspire to that. Okay. Mike, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
I will be categorical. I will say that all those who are fond of rugby and who share rugby values cannot accept the outlook, which recently accept probably a couple of snub-nosed retrograde officials who cannot see further than their own noses.
The president of Georgia's rugby union, Gotcha Svanidze, there, letting loose on World Rugby. Pretty clear his thoughts. Well, the European Tier 2 side have grown to become a regular on the world stage in the past 2 decades. And rugby's origins in the country surprisingly go way back. Well, it stems from a folk sport called lele berti, which translates as field ball. During Soviet times, it became one of the country's most popular sports, with Georgian players dominating the Soviet team. After independence, their first appearance at a World Cup came in 2003. They failed to secure a win, taking on eventual champions England and South Africa in the pool stage. Their best appearance came in 2015 when they beat Namibia and Tonga, only losing to champions New Zealand and the semi-finalist Argentina. However, Georgia have been a powerhouse of the European Rugby Championships in the second tier of European rugby. They've won 8 of the last 10 competitions, finishing as a runner-up in the other 2. They're now ranked 12th in the world, ahead of the likes of Italy, USA, Tonga and Samoa, which is their highest ever world ranking. Well, the man who got them there is Milton Haig. He's the coach of Georgia, a role he's occupied since 2011, and I'm delighted to say he joins us now. Thank you very much for talking to us on Beyond the Game. First things first, Milton, what is your reaction to these leaked proposals as you understand them?
Well, I mean, I've been pretty vociferous in the last, sort of week or so in terms of when we found this stuff out. We were pretty disappointed, obviously. Again, as your previous speakers have been talking about, it's pretty exclusionary. And so, as one of those teams that sit outside of the proposed competition, it's a bit like saying the drawbridge has been pulled up and nobody else is allowed in. So, that in itself is pretty disappointing. We've worked really, really hard to try and make sure that our rugby is sustainable. Our under-20s have competed in the Junior World Championships for the last 4 years, and our under-18s beat France in the European Championship last year. So, it's not just about the national team winning on a competitive stage, but it's about the whole sustainability of rugby. And, we've put, certainly Mr. Ivanishvili, our benefactor, has put, tens of millions of dollars into building new stadiums, new fields, and giving us the infrastructure so that the sport's been able to move as fast as we have. So, it's pretty disappointing when you hear these types of proposals that exclude us.
It seems that the discussion that's been happening in European rugby in terms of the Six Nations and the idea of promotion, relegation, has now been transferred to the global scale. We do have this emergency meeting in Dublin. Are you confident that authorities will take into consideration the concerns of smaller nations like Georgia and the Pacific Islands?
Well, I mean, originally when this was mooted about, I think it was September 2018, where they first came up with the idea. Well, the idea was a couple of years old by then. They said that this, the post-2020 or 2019 World Cup, that there would be more opportunity for everybody, including the Tier 2s, to play against Tier 1s. And we were told that, certainly promised by World Rugby, that we would have a minimum of 2 Tier 1 games a year. If this proposal excludes us and it comes into action in 2 years or 1 year, 2 years' time, we won't have that at all. So, again, we've been banging on the desk for a while now about inclusion, trying to get inclusion into an extended Six Nations. That's not happening. And with this new proposal, it doesn't look as though if it's true that it will be locked down and for 12 years, well, then certainly for the next 12 years, rugby in the Tier 2 area will certainly go into hiatus, that's for sure.
You talk about the drawbridge being pulled up there. If this is a closed shop, have you taken Georgia as far as you can take them? Is that going to be the end of the development of the game in countries like Georgia?
No, I made this pretty public last week, is that it won't kill the game here. The game in itself has its own life here in the country, and it continues to build and gather momentum exponentially every year. So the game is in really, really good health, like in terms of growing the game within the country. What it will stop is it will stop that aspirational side for, our best players in the country to play against the best teams in the world apart from the World Cup. And then when you look at World Cup, if it's only still 20 teams, to actually get to the World Cup will become harder for teams like ours because we're not having that competition of the better teams every year. So, it's a double-edged sword for us in terms of, okay, you've got the World Cup every 4 years, but in fact, what will happen is that those teams, Tier 2 teams, who don't have those opportunities to play these better teams throughout the years apart from World Cup, it will be a struggle to actually qualify.
OK, Milton, very quickly, time is running against us. I've got to ask you whilst you're here. It seems that England are happy to train with you guys, but perhaps not play you on a regular basis. Is that perhaps the reason for the disagreements that we saw on the training pitch last week in Oxford? Can you just tell us what exactly did happen there?
No, there was nothing, mate. That's just two big bulls butting heads, and certainly when you come to cut scrum against Georgia, everybody wants to make sure that certainly we do. We hold ourselves in big pride with our scrum, and so England certainly had a lot of motivation after last year. So just two big bulls coming together. It's something that's just natural. There wasn't anything untoward, and certainly it was pulled up by the coaches pretty quickly. No problem. All
right. Well, let's see if you get invited back. Milton, thank you very much for talking to us. Pleasure. That is all from us here at Beyond the Game. Thank you very much for watching our special. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Thanks for watching.
Beyond the Game, brought to you by Turkish Airlines.